how does racism impact systems? Is systemic racism in America even a thing? Is systemic racism a reality in the church? What are the solutions? Does Black Lives Matter have them? Or are they just a critical theory-driven organization that solves problems fundamentally differently from the church? We'll be talking about that and much more on today's Theology on Air. Well, thanks as always for listening to Theology on Air here on KPFT. This is put out as a podcast. It's live on the radio, although it's pre-recorded these days during COVID-19, but always on KPFT Thursdays at 5 o'clock from their HD2 channel. So we thank you for listening. KPFT is community-sponsored, listener-supported radio. That means that we don't exist without listeners giving to KPFT and supporting what we do, which means that it's radio where you don't have commercial breaks every 7 minutes. You can have long-form conversations, and it's free speech radio. That means we can talk about virtually whatever we want, so long as we don't say those naughty words the FCC doesn't like. So kpft.org is the place to go. If you're a podcast listener and you support this program, you can go to KPFT and support that. As podcasters, of course, we don't make any money nor ask for it. We don't advertise through Anchor or anything like that. We would want any money to go to KPFT who supports us and wants us to have this kind of programming. And especially right now in a time in our country where tensions are very high and there are different proposals really being set forth, I think, kind of different meta-narratives even in a sense being set forth for what we do, how we solve problems, you know, what is most important, what are the past grievances we have to right. KPFT is a forum where we can have those kinds of long-form conversations. So I'm Evan McClanahan. I'm the pastor over at First Lutheran here in Houston. I'm joined, as always, by Sarah Stone, who is the outreach coordinator at MDPC, Memorial Drive Presbyterian Church. And we have very special guests as well. Melissa Pellew has joined us today from South Carolina. She and her husband, Devin, are the co-chapter directors with Ratio Christi at Winthrop University and York Technical College in Rock Hill, South Carolina. And they are equipping college students to defend the Christian faith, as well as engaging unbelieving and skeptical students. Sean Palmer is also with us. He's the teaching pastor at Ecclesia. He's the author of at least 2 books, Scandalous and Unarmed Empire. And Sean, I have to say that whenever people want to know where all like the young people are on Sunday mornings, like as in not in church, I'm like, well, they're either at Ecclesia or they're having brunch, or maybe they're combining the two in some way.
A little of both, I would imagine.
Okay, so, yeah. So Ecclesia, for those who don't know, is a very popular, that's not the right word, but anyway, church here in Houston, and they do a lot of really neat things there. So, but without further ado, Sarah, kind of come back. This is the second part of this conversation. The other one is already on the podcast feed. So what is the difference between that one and this one?
Yeah, in part 1 of this conversation, we really wanted to concentrate on, with the current cultural moment and so many people talking about race issues and racism in America, what is the Christian's response? What does it look like to view racism through the lens of the gospel? And so it was a lot of individual, how has racism affected me? How can I fight back? All that kind of thing. But today we really want to talk about bigger organizations. Where do you give your time to? Where do you give your money to? Where do you give your attention and your energy to? What are the belief systems of different systems? And especially the church. Where should the church be in all of this? How should we be responding, reacting, helping? And so, I think the best way to start, I mean, the phrase that keeps going around social media and conversations is now is the time to be listening. So let's start by doing a little bit of that. I'm just going to ask each of you to tell us a little bit of your own story of how you kind of came to be where you are right now in the ministries that you're at right now, but also if you feel comfortable, how maybe 1 or 2 stories of how racism has affected you or found its way into your own life. And I guess we'll start with Melissa, if you're up for it. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Right. So 40 years old, live in the heart of the South, Rock Hill, South Carolina, have been born and raised in the Carolinas. I was, raised in small town, South Carolina, didn't come to Christ until had a somewhat troubled childhood, came to Christ, at 20 years old during college. And that's why I'm so passionate about college ministry. And I just wanted to learn and study and grow as much as I could. That's when I discovered apologetics. That's how I met my husband, was actually through a chat room talking about apologetics and debating. And and in terms of racial dynamics, and that my husband is Caucasian. We have a daughter who's 7 years old. Again, we live in the heart of the South. I have had, in terms of my relationships with white people, I grew up in a home where my mother and father, they had friends of all different ethnicities. So from a very young age, I was exposed to all different cultures and all different people. And my best friends were white and Indian and Hispanic. And so I would say that I've had maybe a different experience with race than a lot of people. And that's fine. And maybe there's some racism in my life that was there that I didn't see, perhaps. I experienced a lot of racism or colorism. That was probably one of my main issues growing up, was colorism, being a darker skinned black woman within my own Black community, and really not liking my skin color until I became older. So again, I've had some instances that that could be interpreted as racism in my life. I don't know that I'm just one of those people who, I don't know how detrimental it's affected my life or my life choices. But I know that, again, I know my story is not everyone's story.
I didn't make the connection until just now that both of you are in an interracial marriage.
Oh, wow. Okay.
That's cool.
And today is Loving Day, if you are.
It is.
I know.
It is.
I remember presenting a paper on that in college and thinking, this is so recent that we were having this argument. My gosh. Anyway.
Yeah.
Sean,
What's Loving Day?
It's when Loving versus Virginia, the court case about the couple that wanted to get married.
Oh.
Yeah.
She was Black,
I
he was white,
should know
and
that.
it wasn't legal. And that's a
Okay.
precedent-setting case.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
1967, yeah.
Okay.
So it ended miscegenation and a Supreme Court ruling in Virginia, Loving versus Virginia. And so today is the day, June 12th, that marks that ruling from. So if you've not seen the movie Loving, it's a little bit of a slower movie, but of course there are all sorts of documentaries. HBO did a great documentary a couple of years ago on the Lovings. And so today is the day that's celebrated. So my story is not crazily unlike Melissa's in that I grew up in the South. I was born in Jackson, Mississippi, grew up in Mississippi until I was about 12 years old. My family moved to Atlanta. So it's been a Southern story. And I think it's very hard to have a Southern story and be African-American and not have racism permeate all the parts of your life. And so, I mean, if you wanted to ask, like, tell us stories, like there are stories almost under every rock, but at the same time, I graduated high school in Stone Mountain High School outside of Atlanta. And you might remember, if you've heard the I Have a Dream speech a lot, that Dr. King mentioned Stone Mountain. Now, Stone Mountain is a big stone mountain. And the Confederacy used it as an armory during the Civil War. And there's a carving on the side of the mountain of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson and another general. So it's a place very much where the history of the South is celebrated. But when Martin Luther King mentioned that in the I Have a Dream speech, it was completely white. And when I graduated high school, way back last century, our high school, Stone Mountain High School, was the most racially diverse high school in the state. And so we kind of lived through all of the, knowing that was kind of a Klan rally point, at the same time, this incredibly huge shift. And so as a matter of fact, I don't know if you saw, our congregation debuted a video last Friday night called Broad Daylight. And I tell a story that happened to us in our own home just this past February. We also shared the story of one of our ecclesians, a woman named Jenny, who is Asian, an experience that she had at the beginning of the COVID lockdown when a truck driver tried to run her off the street and yelled, she is Asian, and yelled to her that she needs to get out. So if you haven't found it, you can find that on the Ecclesia Houston Facebook page, and that movie is called Broad Daylight. And so what we have seen in the course of our lives, I think it becomes an awakening for so many people as they do become older and look back. And just honestly, like I have 2 teenage daughters, obviously they're biracial. They are much more aware of the racism that permeates their day than I was as a kid, only because I wanted to be interested in other things. But it was always there. Always. I mean, you just can't grow up where I grew up and not have that. When I was a sophomore in high school, there was a place outside of Atlanta called Cumming, Georgia, and there were marches every day in Cumming, Georgia. Not every day, every weekend for several months, because it's completely white town. I can't remember what happened that kind of was the that instigated these events, but I remember there are signs in Cumming when I was in high school, so this was early 90s, saying things like, niggers need to be out by sundown. I remember during one of the marches, a Klan member calling Atlanta the nigger capital of the world. So these are places, I mean, this is within easy driving distance of where I was living at the time. So those were just experiences as a kid. I remember being in college, interviewing for an internship for a church that's here in Houston, not very far from where Sarah is now and where our West Side campus is. And at the end of the interview, the guy who was interviewing me for the summer internship just handed me back my resume. Like there's just kind of no chance. Or hearing time and time again, because I got my undergraduate degree is in youth ministry. And I was interviewing at these churches that were not predominantly Black churches oftentimes. And I can't tell you how many times the word back to me was, we don't think you can relate to our kids, or we don't think our kids can relate to you, which is a way of coloring the interview process. Now, the kids had not met me. I had not met any of the kids. Right. So there was absolutely no verifiable way that you could think that, except you had a fundamental belief system about the way the world ought to be, and the order of how things ought to be. So that's just a little bit of where we are. Yeah.
It's so interesting. One of our guests 2 days ago had such a similar story about not getting a job. His was a phone interview. And I guess he, quote, sounded white on the phone. And then they looked him up on Facebook and said, oh, we didn't realize you're Black. We don't think you're going to be a good fit here. We don't think you can relate. Very similar. Right. So it's heartbreaking. So as we think about everything in the wake of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and various other stories that have really made this sort of rise of the current, indignation and rage about what's happening in our country, maybe you can each just kind of talk to how we see the country dealing with this, and for better or for worse, what you think of that. Like, we've got people protesting, we've got people rioting, we've got people, calling for certain reforms, some more dramatic than others. So maybe just broad strokes, what do you see that you're like, that's going to help, and other things are like, that's not? And then we'll move on to talking about, specific institutions.
My broad just assessment is there's obviously a lot of confusion. There's a lot of disconnect. There's a lot of people talking past each other right now. There's obviously a lot of anger and things of that nature. I personally, protesting is, I believe in it. I've been a part of several protests, for various reasons, throughout my life. And I was disheartened to see protests turning violent. I was hoping that I'm hoping for a more positive outcome when you look at these deaths and how unjust that they were, hoping for more of a positive outcome that leads to discussion and us being able to connect and unify more so than divide. I believe that the unifying factor in everything, and the only one who can truly unify us is Jesus Christ. I think that this is an opportunity for the church to be the church and to be different, to have a different response than the world. I think it's an opportunity for us to point people to Jesus in the process of standing for what's right and what's just. I think it's an opportunity for us to talk about what biblical justice is, what it looks like, and to be a reasonable, sound, loving voice in the midst of all of the confusion, rather than adding to it. So I think I've seen the church in many ways kind of fail right now, this test, and not stand for biblical truth, and it's in some ways contribute to some of the confusion. But I think it's an opportunity that that we can still take advantage of it. So that's my broad assessment of the situation.
Sean, did you want to add anything to that? Just first blush thoughts.
Well, obviously, I think the history of the country is pretty evident in that things don't change without protest. Because why would they? I mean, and that happens not just in government or in church, just in relationships. If someone doesn't say to another person, this isn't right, this isn't what we need to do, ought to do, if someone doesn't actually protest the status quo, then nothing ever changes. Because if people think everything's okay, then we don't change arbitrarily. Yeah. That's just human nature. And then another piece of human nature is human beings, especially adults. Adults don't change. This is basic pedagogy, and this is what I teach, preachers. Adults don't change unless they think they have to. Right? So that's just the way that human beings function. And so what protests do is they highlight the ways in which things have to change. So if there is always a way, there are always better ways to have difficult conversations, but you have to have difficult conversations. The problem is that if you have one party in that conversation who is entrenched that nothing should change, then you have to leverage tension to get them to the table. So, and this has been the nature of protests. Well, and it's actually one of the ways that in the 60s that, you take the Montgomery bus boycott, for instance. Alabama didn't change because they saw the light about segregation. They changed because the bus company was going out of business. Yeah. And the bus company said to the state, we're going out of business because the people who use our services are no longer using our services. So something has to change. That's not something that happened because people had a really good conversation about it. That you have to ratchet up tension. This happens the same way in the church when things have to change, or in any system. When things change, they only change when it becomes unbearable for the status quo to remain the same. So when people decide they want to eat better, lose weight, they probably went to the doctor who said, you're going to die. Like all of those things. And so you can never lose sight of that. So folks who say, well, why do we have to protest? Probably we've reached a level of protest because the people who are empowered either ignored or dismissed what came before protest. And, from an ecclesiological standpoint, you have to be very mindful of what you believe is the role of legislation versus the role of church. And where do those intertwine? Where can we be helpful to one another? There have been a lot of calls as of late that say, only God can heal racism, which in a sense is very true. Like even King said, a law can't make a man love me, but he can keep him from lynching me, right? So there are two different spheres. But we don't say that about other things. Like we've never said only Jesus can stop people from having abortion. No, we work for legislation for those things, for people who really believe in those things. So we have to make hard determinations about why are we treating some things in this category that are only spiritually going to be changed, and other things in this other category where we need legislation and lawmakers and judges, and we need to elect the person who's going to. So all those things have to be discerned, and we can't. Part of the problem with the church is that the American church is so enmeshed in America and so comfortable in American system that the status quo functionally works for us. And so it's always in our reflexive best interest to keep the status quo. And I think times of protest force us to ask hard questions about whether or not we are on the side of the status quo because it works for us or because that's the just side to be on.
Such a good distinction. You're muted, Evan. Hold.
Sorry. Okay. Let me ask about the protest from this point of view. I think all of us would agree that protests are part of what is necessary. I would make a distinction that not the content of every protest is something that we would admire, right? I mean, there are all kinds of bad people that protest really dumb things that we don't like. So
Yeah.
as Christians, we'd want to determine, like, well, what's the content? And so one of the things that I'm trying to figure out as I look at what's going on is that Black Lives Matter as an organization has a lot more power now than they did, say, 5 years ago. I mean, almost overnight, I see many white people, for example, the hashtag, it's like we're fully on board. I read an email today. This is at American Vision, and someone was told this. They teach in the academy, and they were basically told, they were informed by an official faculty representative of one of the institutions that I teach at, that if I do not support BLM, am unwilling to consciously address race in my courses, and I'm not willing to seek out training to learn to be anti-racist, then I'm unwelcome to teach there. That seems to be a pretty fast change from, again, when Black Lives Matter came on the scene, say 5-6 years ago, where now it's almost become the orthodoxy that we have to subscribe to. Mm-hmm. And so I'm interested in hearing about, though, the distinction between the hashtag, mm-hmm. the organization, and those three words in that order. I don't see them as all the same thing, but maybe that's because I have white privilege and I have white supremacy, sort of, as a result of my being a white male American. So, but as a Christian, I want to evaluate groups and organizations and movements like this from a biblical lens. And I don't want to get it wrong for fear of offending my Lord. I don't want to get it wrong for fear of offending my neighbor. So where do y'all think I fall, where I should fall as a Christian? Because that's the only, I have an audience of one. Where should I fall, given your experience and thoughts on this, on Black Lives Matter?
I can start. I mean, Sean and I may disagree on this. I can tell, I don't think that if you use a hashtag that you're sinning or going to hell or anything like that. I think that it is a matter of conscience, but I myself don't use a hashtag. When I'm aware of, obviously I think a lot of us are aware of, the organization itself, that 2013 Black Lives Matter, the organization became popularized by the hashtag, and during the Trayvon Martin killing, which was very, very tragic, in Florida. With the guiding principles of the movement itself, the organization, things such as the being queer affirming, being trans affirming, the negative view of the nuclear family structure. I find these things to be counterproductive to the movement itself, and to the plight of Black people in America. So me, myself, I don't use the hashtag. I don't believe that Black lives just matter. I believe that Black lives are sacred and that they're worthy because we're created in the image of God. Mm-hmm. And so my view of Black people, brown people, white people, Asian people is much bigger than a hashtag. It's much bigger than a movement. It's connected to my Lord and Savior, who is the creator of all. And so I don't personally use a hashtag because of my personal convictions, and because I do think the movement itself is counterproductive. I believe that when I hashtag, that I'm giving credence to the movement itself, which, we know that's how hashtags work. That's why we do these different campaigns and hashtag this, hashtag that. I mean, not things like, my kid, summertime in the backyard, those kind of like just random things. But when we're talking about political campaigns or social movements, those things do matter. And so, again, I am just, like I said earlier, I'm just in favor of Christians having a Christian response, setting ourselves apart in all of this, having a positive, Christ-centered, biblical model for reconciliation and moving forward, and having real solutions. I feel like sometimes with the movement itself, when it talks about justice and activism, I don't think it's clearly defined enough. I believe in activism. I believe in justice, obviously, because I believe that all people are made in God's image and that they're worthy of being treated fairly and equally. But when we're looking at our biblical standards of what is right and wrong, moral, immoral, those standards, we're held to a higher standard than the world. And so when things are not clearly defined, like, if it's okay with movements, I mean, we've seen, blocking traffic and, violence and things like that. And I'm not saying that the movement itself is saying do this or do that, but it's because it's not, there's no clear definitions of what is okay to do and what's not okay to do. There's a lot of emotion involved. And so, when I do my, for instance, when I do 4 Days for Life with my pro-life group, I was a campaign coordinator for a number of years in Charlotte. When we had our vigils and our peaceful demonstrations and things like that, we signed on as Christians of this is what's okay, this is not what's okay. If you're not okay with peace, then you can't be a part of what we're doing. Because at the end of the day, I don't want our witness, even if we're standing for something that's right, in terms of aborting children and trying to stop that, I don't want our witness before the world and Christ to be ruined. So I'm just in favor of a uniquely Christian response to these things that sets us apart and that draws people to Christ in the process and that offers real solutions.
Okay. Sean, what about you? What are your takeaways about Black Lives Matter?
Well, there are a couple of different things that need to be disentangled when you talk about Black Lives Matter. There is like the organization, which I think most folks aren't all that familiar with, but kind of in grand, not to get too far in the weeds. So since early on in my ministry days, I have come to a position on most things, which is to say yes where I can say yes. Mm-hmm. So when it deals with most people or most organizations or any group, well, one, I hardly ever use hashtags anyway, but the idea is to say like, what about this can I say yes to? And so we live in such a divided and partisan world. It's what Alistair McIntyre called like a society on fragments, that we try to put together life in this really convoluted way where you have to say like, I'm a conservative or I'm a progressive or I'm a this. And what that tends to do to us is it makes us take on the full boat of someone else's agenda. Instead of being the person who says that I'm going to say yes where I can say yes, which also means I'm going to say no where I can say no. So can I absolutely affirm the idea that I am for the liberation and the liberation of and equal treatment of Black Americans, either in the workplace, in society, in policing? Absolutely. And that part of Black Lives Matter, I completely endorse and support. So I don't need to like throw on a hashtag or anything else. But there are places that people who would typically disassociate themselves with a group like Black Lives Matter, where there are some things that they do that I would equally affirm. And so the idea that I find this just the oddest social media trend when someone says like they read a book and says, well, I don't agree with everything in this book. Well, of course you don't agree with everything. like either you're stupid or you think the rest of us are stupid, that we can say this was worth my time and energy to invest in, or these are the things that I can affirm. And we are so coward into being lumped in with everybody that we actually create a good deal of space and distance with potential allies because we just can't say, I'm going to say yes to this piece of that I can say yes to. Mm-hmm. That we are actually more interested as a culture and society, and this is just America in general, we are much more interested in defining our enemies than defining our allies and what it is that we are allied with them for. Mm-hmm. And so people are much more complex than we give them credit for. And so if someone says something and you think you don't agree with it, or you're a friend of theirs and they post something, or they go, the question isn't, the response isn't, well, did you know about this about Black Lives Matter? The response is, tell me more about that. Mm-hmm. Like, what about that? Like, if you support, like if you have a Blue Lives Matter sticker on your truck, the response is always, tell me more about that. What resonates with you about that? If I'm going to have a conversation with you about it at all, rather than to just lump folks into this category, this pre-made category. And this is the problem that American Christians are having. It's the problem of the evangelical mind. I don't know that any of you have read that book, but you probably should. The diagnosis and the problem of the evangelical mind is there's just not much of one. Like we just don't do very much hard thinking. We are a subsection of the population that is predisposed to prefabricated, pre-made responses to everything. And you can tell when someone is just giving you the talking points versus when someone has actually thought through their position. And so a lot of the questions that I'm asked aren't even really all that interesting questions to answer, not the ones that you've asked. We're just like, no, like, let's talk about what's really at stake for people. And like years ago, I had a church member come up to me and he says, well, don't all lives matter? Which is a disingenuous question.
Sure.
Because obviously they do.
Yeah.
But what you're trying to do is you're trying to diminish the Black Lives Matter movement. So why would you ask that question? Why would someone ask the question, well, don't all lives matter? Like, is there a response to that question that could, in the least bit, not be signaling of a greater virtue of the person who asked it in the first place?
It's part one of a two gotcha kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so I guess this is fascinating to me because I love the idea of saying yes to what is virtuous in any organization and saying no to what's not. But I think probably all four of us would agree that you could get to some point with any particular organization where you think, man, I actually align fully, or man, I can't have anything to, if Hitler were to come back and start some kind of white supremacist, whatever, I think we would all be like, no, that's not us. So when we look at something like Black Lives Matter, I wonder how much, sort of yes material there is to when it tips the scales or the opposite. And one of the things I've been trying to do, and I want to hear you guys talk about this, is the philosophy behind Black Lives Matter and some of these other movements that are going on, to me, seems to be coming from this, some people are calling it neo-Marxism. I don't know that I would use that term, but this like critical theory, cultural critical theory, critical race theory, this idea of the oppressed and the oppressors and how we've got to like flip the power on its head, which on the one hand sounds awesome. But when you start digging into it, it's got some inherent problems. So maybe can we speak to the philosophy that kind of goes into some of these liberation movements? Because I think maybe that will get at, where we can say yes and where we can't.
Sean, I'll let you go first.
Well, I mean, when you think about things like critical race theory, like it's actually produced a lot of good conversations that we need, conversations around things like intersectionality and thinking a little bit more deeply about how we structure ourselves. And what we're fundamentally dealing with is, I think the conversation about critical race theory is a distraction from what's happening on the street. Like, no law is going to be changed because of lawmakers reading and coming to conclusions about critical race theory. Churches aren't going to base many of their decisions, though not none. I mean, like, you see a lot of things have changed because of critical race theory, but my gut tells me that it's a distraction to diminish the impact of it. And there are some things that I think are really helpful and some things that aren't. And
let me pause you
everything,
for a second,
yeah.
Because I made an error in not defining terms. So maybe before you continue what you're saying, maybe you can tell our audience just like one or two sentences, what is critical race theory? I'm so sorry that I didn't do that. People are like, what are they even talking about? Sorry,
well,
go ahead.
It's actually pretty complicated, and my wife would be much better at answering this question.
Is she there? Pull her.
But, like, suffice it to say, like, this is what I want to say about it, because I have actually been, I've actually been taken to task by some of my white friends for not using critical race theory enough. And it's not that it's not helpful. And so, and that's another power play, right? If you say something is Marxist, like, you're categorizing it in a way that makes it indefensible for people who also feel any sort of affinity toward their democratic country. So, like, I think we need to be really attuned to the linguistic power plays that get worked out in these kind of discussions. Like it's just not an honest assessment.
Right. The only reason I even threw the word Marxism in there is because I noticed that Alicia Garza, she's a self-proclaimed Marxist. I think that's an area of pride. So it wasn't necessarily a dig. It was just like this is part of the platform, I think, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah. I mean, it's an epistemological, philosophical system that uses critical theory to assess society. And it has a lot to do with historical power and who's currently in power. It talks about the centrality of intersectionality in terms of race and racism. It talks a lot about domination and ideology. If there's a commitment to social justice and defined in some particular ways, it's got a lot to do with experience knowledge, which everybody uses anyway, and interdisciplinary ways of thinking. So all these sort of things, and a lot that I'm probably forgetting right now, kind of come together in a particular way to create critical race theory. And it's really been a hot topic among academicians. But it's like, it can be really useful. Just look at the ideas around intersectionality, right? So I think the best examples actually came from my 16-year-old several months ago, and she was talking about a factory in Michigan. And this factory had was heralding how many African-American workers they had. And one section, and they also were heralding how many female workers they had in like another section. But at this like engineer level, they had no African-American females. And that at each one of those intersections, and they can be almost anything, you get a different set of issues and circumstances that have to be thought through and dealt with. So I think that's really helpful. So if you take a look at so many of the companies, for instance, who in the last week have come out and written statements and affirmed that they believe that Black lives truly matter, that's wonderful and great. But if you look at their board, you look at their C-suite, it's all white males. Well, you could say that Black lives matter, but it doesn't actually. So if you don't take an intersectional look at that, and you just like, well, we have a lot of African Americans, or we have a lot of Asians, or we have a lot of Latinx people, but the women or the men or whatever subset that you want to look at only seem to rise to a certain level. Like that's been really helpful. And so that's the kind of thing that I want to affirm versus some other things that I don't think are as helpful, but they're all in the same pot.
Can I jump in? And I know Melissa wants to come back on that, but just to go back to like the factory example. So here's a question I think a lot of people would have. Not, again, people might say, oh yeah, of course you have that question, white privilege, white supremacy. And this is where I'm trying to figure out, like, again, biblical worldview versus say an intersectional worldview, which I think they can be some overlap, like the widows, like the widow of Nain, right? Had no son, had no husband. She was sort of doubly in a tight spot. So you might say Jesus showed compassion on her. I've heard that example used. You could think of others in the Bible. But in that example, should the company have a policy that says, all right, doesn't matter who applies for this next engineering position, a Black woman ought to get the job. She rises to the higher, to the resume, is at the top of the stack now, because maybe it's just a show. We want to prove that we're committed to Black Lives Matter, so we do this. I don't know. I mean, is that what they should do? Because if we talk about practical legislation or something, what would that look like? And is that what we want? Especially when we talk about systems,
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's one that's frequently asked, but the answer is actually downstream. The answer, like every company in the world recruits talent from somewhere. Mm-hmm. And so how do we hire? Where do we go to look to hire? So a friend of mine here in Houston does training with very large companies, and they were talking about diversity in their hiring practices. And what she heard time and time again from companies is like, we can't find diverse talent for these jobs. And she said, well, where do you look? And she says, well, most of them come from internships. They have great resumes because of internships. That's how those guys got their jobs. And so she asked, well, what if you have a really great kid coming out of school who would be a great talent for your organization? But let's say he had to work every summer and didn't have the freedom to go and get these internships that are unpaid at these companies. How do you find that? Like, and they didn't have an answer. And so the problem was not that they weren't trying to find certain people, or that there weren't people who were educated to do that. That they had a problem way downstream in recruiting. So how do people come to this place? And churches have to ask that question too, and they look around and they see all of the same kinds of people, whether that's racial, economically, educationally. How do people find us? Well, you attract what you are. That's a church growth principle that's as old as the hills, right? You attract what you are. So we have to be different. The leadership here has to be a different sounding looking leadership in order to attract a different kind of profile for their talent. And so it's not just, hey, we've got a job open down in X, let's go find Y to fill that position. But we have to take a look at our whole organization to see how do we come into contact with people who we hire. What are some tacit and overt ways that we might be signaling to some potential employees that they wouldn't be comfortable or feel right about living here? And it's got to be more than just, hey, this thing's happening in the news and we wrote a letter and posted it on social media. Like that's a pretty thin way to be. I mean, that's a pretty thin way to be about the issue of actual bringing about change.
Yeah. Melissa, I want to give you a chance to kind of go back to the question about the philosophy behind some of the movements that are gaining popularity right now, critical race theory. What are your thoughts? And don't hold back, because I know you have thoughts about this.
Well, I mean, the concept of critical theory, as we're discussing, basically individuals, their identity is parsed in groups, and you're looking at a dominant oppressed group and a minority oppressed group. And so that can, transcend, race or gender or sexual orientation and these sort of things. And so people are viewed through those lens. That is how you view people, is not individuals. And so, but as groups. And so, I mean, there's some benefits to critical theory in terms of helping us, we understand that it deals with race as more of a social construct, which, we believe is not, like this biological machine, but it's a social construct. But then, I mean, I think what Evan was saying is that when you talk about worldview, I do think that it does, when one does hold to this firmly and in their value system, I think that it does take on a worldview in and of itself, because then the goal of one's journey in life is liberation, whether that is as an oppressed or as the oppressed people. The goal is to liberate yourself from your power per se, or to use your power to ultimately liberate the oppressed people. And the oppressed people, their goal is liberation, is from being in this kind of stuck in this class. But I mean, with the system itself, you're always going to have this oppressed and oppressor dichotomy. So I don't think it offers real solutions. I think again, in contrast to the biblical worldview, where God created individuals. Acts 7 tells us that God determines our boundaries, our where we're to be from, the time in which we're born. All of that is in God's providence, and that our goal is ultimately liberation from sin and union with Christ. And so through that, obviously we can work towards making society a better place here on earth for others. But I think the goals can be, or the worldview itself is different in terms of what the end result should look like. Is the end result that people are liberated from some social structure, and that an oppressed a person in a dominant class denounces that and or is the goal for all of us to be in union with Christ, in unity together, and working together in ways to make real reform in our society?
So I'm so many questions. When you said something about the power of the oppressor, given critical race theory, I mean, this is where the term and the idea about white privilege was born, right? Because the oppressor can recognize his or her ways of oppression, and one of those ways is to recognize, when we're talking about race, white privilege. So would you say that because you don't agree with the worldview of critical race theory, that all of that you disagree with? Do you think white privilege exists? Do you think it's something we need to spend time talking about? And of course, Sean, I would love you to weigh in too, because this is, a lot of stuff that's happening on social media right now and in conversations, even just one-on-one, somebody will say something and someone else will say, well, that's your privilege showing, whether that's about gender or about race. And and I'm wondering how helpful that is. Should we be doing that? Should we be looking for places where there are privilege, or is there a next step we should be moving? I mean, talk through that a little bit with me.
Yeah, I think it's complex. I think that, I think it's all tied together with, when one does find a critical theory, then yes, you are looking at, privilege and that from the, particularly with race, with white people. And then there's a sense in which white people have to understand. And I think, even earlier with Evan, as he was talking, and he's like, well, maybe that's my white supremacy, or that maybe that's my privilege talking. And so that's kind of how everything, I'm not saying that you adhere to that, Evan, but you were trying to, as you were navigating the conversation, just asking questions. But that tends to be how everything is interpreted, is, well, maybe I can't say that's wrong, or maybe I can't disagree with this person, or maybe I can't, call this into question or anything like that, because I'm white, and because my whiteness is I'm blinded by my whiteness. I need, when you talk about things like white fragility, and it either coming to the terms that you are just, when we talk, well, I guess we should go back and just talk about privilege itself. I think there's different kind of privileges in life. I think there's an American privilege. I think that there is a 2-parent home household privilege. I think that's probably the biggest privilege that one can have. Is that bad? I don't think that those things are bad. Does that set you up for more success in life? Absolutely. So I think that what tends to happen is we look at the disparity. I'm not saying that there is no, I'm not saying that the theory of white privilege is innocuous, or that it's of no effect. I'm just saying that we tend to oversimplify things when we look at racial disparities, and we look at things like socioeconomics, and household incomes, and college educational levels, and private business ownership, and things like that. And we look at the disparities, or maybe incarceration rates and things like that. And so the narrative becomes, well, it's obviously white people have some sort of privilege, and that's why these disparities exist. I think there are unfair laws, that we need to work on to reform, to make life, like, for instance, I work with inmates and do ministry with inmates. There's things that we can do to help them to transition back into society better, and things like that. But at the same time,
for the sake of time, I want to hear Sean's thoughts on white privilege and any other of those kind of concepts that came out of. But then I do want to get us to, what is the church, what do we need to get to doing? But Sean, what comes to your mind with white privilege? Yeah,
so the misconception about white privilege is that it means that white people who reach any sort of level of success didn't have to work. And white privilege isn't about work. White privilege isn't about blessing like a lot of other things that are a blessing. White privilege is fundamentally about access. when we talk about white privilege, what we're talking about is an advantaged access to things like resources, money, education, and social status. So here's a great example just from the last week. Here's a picture of privilege, right? So when George Floyd died, there wasn't too long, and this happens every time that there is an unarmed Black man who's killed, that what we quickly see from certain quarters is a recitation, a rehearsal of their past, everything that they ever did wrong. But when Brock Turner rapes a girl at Stanford behind a dumpster, he gets a light sentence because of what he will be, of his potential. And so this is a picture of white privilege, is that that whites are seen for what they can contribute, and Blacks are seen oftentimes for what they've done in the past, right? And so like that's about access to a certain social standing that is rooted in American slavery and segregation and lack of education. So if you just take, I learned just in the last year how actual money works, because when I started thinking about the things that I will be able to pass on to my children, because my parents' generation were the first generation in both sides of my family to be able to accumulate any wealth. And it dawned on me like, oh, this is why my white friends in college, that's why their parents were able to pay their rent and to send them money, because they didn't start out not just at zero, but under zero when they came into the world. And that is a privilege that is rooted in an economic system that for most of the history of the country has tried very diligently to keep Black people as a permanent underclass. So when we talk about white privilege, we're not saying you never had to work for anything. White privilege doesn't mean that you don't suffer. White privilege means that you have a level of access because of both history and social standing and being the dominant culture that not everybody else has. Like there are some presumptions made about your goodness, right? So we saw this this past week too, where you've got this police force out very upset because they feel like they are good police officers and they are being lumped in with these bad police officers. Well, that's what every unarmed Black person, every person who's not committed a crime who gets questioned by the police in their own home, as I was on February 9th of 2020, about whether I had warrants out on me. That's exactly how they feel. But the Harvard, I think it's Harvard or Princeton, has the implicit bias study, the test that you can take. That implicit bias is part of white privilege. So it's not just about whether or not each of us as individuals have some good things associated with who we are. It's about this pervasive access that everybody doesn't have, and that pervasive access is granted to people based on their skin color.
We only have a couple of minutes. We have like 4 minutes. So each of you take about 2 minutes, and we can go longer on Facebook, but for the podcast, like I said, we're going to try to keep it to 58 minutes. What do we do in that situation? What do we do? I mean, what can we do? I think that's something that a lot of people feel like I can't snap my fingers and make this all change. I only have so much influence. I only can do so much. And I'm a Christian, so we're doing this show from a Christian worldview. I'm limiting it to that. I'm not going to borrow from critical theory unless I can really correlate it to scriptural teachings. But what can we do as Christians on all these issues? What would that look like?
I mean, I think that, again, we need to look different than the world. I think that I think the individualization of people and not placing, part of it is that people have the sense of guilt and that they're not doing enough or that they can't do enough. And so they're starting already from this position of helplessness. And I think that in our daily lives, as we're living as believers with one another, I think that those interpersonal relationships, I think that loving our neighbor as ourselves and teaching that, modeling that to our children, and doing that as we go about our lives, reaching out to people in need, and mentoring, and all these things are just things that we can do in our sphere of influence. We can only do so much as individuals, right? And so I feel like with Christ's power and love that we go out and we love like he loved, and we do what he did, and we show his, we're his hands and feet. And that might seem like it's an oversimplification, but I think it's a lot, it's a more biblical concept than people walking around feeling guilty about their skin color or feeling oppressed about their skin color, but actually seeing one another through the lens of the imago Dei, being created in the image of God. And that as we do that, we model that to the world. And that's in the limited time, I would say that's a major change that we can impact, affect in our communities and in our lives.
Sean, what about you?
Yeah, there are a couple of things there. I think, first of all, you have to start with that every Christian has the same responsibility, right? And this is rooted in the incarnation. So what does Jesus do? This is Philippians 2. Like when you have the power, your job as a follower of Christ is to leverage that power for the benefit and blessing of other people. It starts in Genesis 12, like you are blessed to be a blessing. So regardless of where you are or who you are, like your call is to do that. And then you fold into that humility is a fundamental posture of Christianity, that you have to enter into everything with humility. And third, I would say we really need a fundamental rethinking of what the gospel is. Because what has happened in the American church is that we have misread, I think, and I'm not the only one who thinks this, so it's not original to me. The biggest problem in the church in the first century was the church. And the biggest problem in that church was, how are Jews and Gentiles supposed to get along together? It's in every letter of Paul. It's the central feature of what he's writing about. It's why he takes a collection in 1 Corinthians 8. When Paul gets around to writing Romans 1:17, and for that great passage, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel, what is he not ashamed of? He's not ashamed of this fundamental belief that God has done something in Jesus Christ for which Jews and Gentiles will now be together as one people. That is what God is doing. This is Ephesians 2, that Jesus himself breaks down the dividing wall of hostility between us. So that's a fundamental issue of the New Testament. I bet if you walked into most churches in America right now and you asked them, what's the central issue in the New Testament that Paul addresses? They would not name that issue. They would name personal sin. And the Bible hardly speaks at all about personal sin in comparison to corporate sin. Most of the use in the New Testament, most of the use in the Old Testament are plural. It is talking about corporate sin and how do we live together as people. We have Americanized the gospel to such an extent that we believe this is about individual flourishing. And that's not at all what the Bible's trying to do. And I'm not the first person who's ever said that. I mean, that's and if you've taken Greek, you know that, right? So you've had that great, declension word, pas upon, like you say it so many times, you have to learn it so deeply because the use in the New Testament are plural by and large. And so it is talking to the fundamental idea of what's happening in the scriptures are, how are these people going to live and get along together under the banner of Christ? And if you take that and you twist it into what's happening under my roof and personal piety, you are missing a huge chunk of what the New Testament writers are getting at.
Podcast listeners, we are out of time, so we're going to keep this conversation going a little bit longer. We don't want to hold our guests too long, but find us on Facebook, facebook.com/Theology on Tap Houston, because Theology on Air at KPFT is a ministry of Theology on Tap Houston. So for all of our guests for the podcast, we'll see you next time. We want to encourage you to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed. But our Facebook listeners can get a few more minutes. So, one of my questions is in that vein of everything you two just said, which is basically, is interpersonal stuff enough? Now, why do I say that? Because let's just take social media as the window of this world. It's basically the answer to that is no. That if I were to say, look, as a white person, I have good relationships with black people, no one can speak against my character on this issue, I would instantly be, you're just I don't know. I'm sure there's a name for it, like gaslighting, or some fancy word that someone came up with, but you're just putting forth, you're just being defensive. Mm-hmm. You're not really listening. You're putting up the wall to justify yourself. Yeah. You're not solving the real problem of race. So, and yet when I do think about this biblically, not to disagree with Sean that there aren't corporate sins versus individual sins, I still think that a biblical understanding of justice is fundamentally that we are held accountable for what we do, and that we aren't held accountable as groups. Now, maybe Sean might say that I'm just wrong about that. But is the interpersonal stuff enough as Christians, or should basically our life's work be about group reconciliation? I mean, how has the world changed? Maybe that would be a way to put it. How do we change the world for the better? Is it one person at a time, as the cliche might suggest, or is it we work for group change? And then does that become unbiblical?
It can be. It definitely can be. I mean, obviously I don't think there's anything obviously wrong with acknowledging our different ethnicities and because, different cultural differences and things like that. But it can become an idol. It can become our primary identity. And that's just my concern with these theories, these social theories, which is what they are. They're social theories that try to explain data and some of the lived experiences, and it tries to, bring everything together. I think that, but there are some truths in them, right? That we can bring out. But ultimately, yeah, we can become so much a part of a group, and that is the idea of, I think, with the New Testament, I think that was the problem. I don't think the problem was, I think that it was this group mentality of, Jew and Gentile, and that was the issue. And so I think, when Christ talks about, no Jew, no Gentile, male nor female, we're all one in Christ, he offers the answer there in breaking those things down. Again, in God's providence, we are who we are, right? And we can be proud. We can be proud of our skin color, proud of our ethnicity, and our culture and things like that. And we, within a biblical framework, within a biblical justice, like you said, Sean, it's because we ourselves have offended God, because we ourselves have broken his laws and his commandments, that we, when we talk about being reconciled to him and that whole transaction that happens on the cross, because of that, we understand that all of us are sinners and that kind of thing. But anyway, that's our motivation for seeking justice, biblical justice, is that we have been reconciled to God. We have broken his law. We want to see others come to him. We want to see the wrongs in society righted, right? We want people to come to Jesus and to know him and to see him for who he is.
Can I jump in here for a second? Because you said something that I want to hear both of you, maybe you give like a very practical response to. You said you want to see the wrongs righted, or we want to see injustices come to light and happen less, right? I mean, we all want that. So is it as simple as just loving your neighbor and being salt and light? Or do we need to be, I think many Christians would say we need to be, going to the polls with our, with how we want the world to be better. Do we need to be protesting? Do we need to be trying to get different legislation in place? Do we need to defund the police? Do we need to go to our own church polity or church bodies and try to change things? And what would that look like? I guess I'm just asking, like, I keep seeing this stuff on social media about it's not enough to sit there. It's not enough to say that you're with us and that you're listening. Do something. Well, I know what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to give my money to an organization that I can't stand behind, but but I still want to fight racism. Like, how do I do that?
I mean, I'm very politically involved in, in that kind of thing. I think, but I mean, if I'm going to be honest, I think sometimes that even in our political affiliations and in our desire to make our society better and our communities better as minorities, sometimes we do vote against our best interest. And I think that those things negatively impact our communities. So I think that is part of the problem I see with some of these models, these social theories, is that there is no inward kind of transparency, where we look at within our communities, what are some of the responsibilities within that have contributed to some of these disparities. It always becomes, this group versus that group, and it's this group that is the issue. But I agree. I think we have voted against our best interests. I think that that has led to a lot of decaying of our family structures and things like that. So, but yeah, I believe that policy does matter.
Mm-hmm.
How we vote matters. The people who we stand behind and who we promote and who we endorse, it matters.
Yeah.
If their worldview is something that is fundamentally unbiblical.
Well, that's all of them.
Yeah.
I mean, not really, but like
none of them are perfectly biblical, but they're
all socialists.
Yeah. There's no perfect, obviously, with earthly government, but I think that we can stand back and look at some of those things too, the laws and reform. Reform is very important. It has, I don't know, we just have to look at it from a position of morality first, and and personal responsibility as well, and in contributing to better in our society. I don't like the idea of having to depend upon white people to change my society or to change my my world or my family, or that to me becomes a dependent structure in and of itself as well. My God I depend upon my God. I'm not saying that there are no that there may be people out there that think negatively of me because of my skin color, but that's just not how I don't live my life in that viewing people that way. I view people as in
I want
God's.
to make sure we get Sean's thoughts on this before we go too long. Sean, what do we do?
So I think, Evan, your question was about whether like personal work was enough. Mm-hmm. And that's really something that's got to be disentangled, right? Because it depends on what you believe personal work is. So you have to define your terms. Like when you say things like, is loving my neighbor enough? Well, who is my neighbor? Right. And so like the hungry in my city are my neighbor, and I can choose to see my neighbor as the people living in my neighborhood, or I cannot. Mm-hmm. The people who living around the world who are having American bombs dropped on them are my neighbor. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I do have a responsibility to those people. So in a sense, personal work is enough, but if it is, then I don't think we've done enough personal work.
Right. The orbit is bigger than we think.
Right. Yeah. And so the trap is and it's been laid very carefully over the last 30 or 40 years, is that the scriptures do not define my family as the people who live under my house. Mm-hmm. The scriptures define my family as those who follow Jesus, all who are made in the image of God. Mm-hmm. And so when we talk about who our brothers and sisters are, when we talk about who we are given to care for, it is the entire family and not just the family that I love the most. And the truth is, I love my daughters the most. Right. And so I think basically what it's a distinction without a difference to say, is personal work enough? The problem is we haven't done enough personal work. Like it should, when we see someone starving, when we see someone dying at the hands of a power. And if you think about it, if you're just a pure American, like there is a law enforcement system that you have to comply with or they will put you in jail. Like that is, so that's where we start. And most of those in my lifetime, people I have interfaced with are good people. Like I don't have any hesitation in saying that, but you're forced to comply. Let's say that we live in a world where there are enough people involved in that occupation who shouldn't be involved in that occupation. It is not the loving thing to do to only care about the people who suffer at the hands of those women and men if they are close to me. And so mass incarceration dismantles families as well. Mm-hmm. Unjust meeting of laws where Black and brown people are given more jail time than white people affects families as well. People being held right here in Houston in Harris County Jail for sometimes over a year pre-trial affects families as well. Mm-hmm. And so those are moral issues. I think the prophets would say all of those are moral issues. And so to be concerned about some moral issues and not be concerned about other moral issues, I think is a really difficult dance for me to do.
Yeah.
So like either like it's you have to concern yourself with the whole thing. Now, this is where the beauty of the church comes in, because I'm just one person. I can't do everything, right? And we can't be involved in everything. So the question then becomes, what is mine to do? And as things arise, that may shift and change over time. But the things that I'm passionate and care about, what I have been given a unique voice to contribute to, I should care about in a particular, unique, and powerful way that absorbs my time, energy, and resources. So I think the question is one that we need to simply broaden, and we need to call the church's attention to that, because we have had in my lifetime, such an intense focus on the family that we have misdescribed what the Bible calls family.
Fair enough. Evan, I think, has kind of a final question for us.
Yeah, I do. I'm just thinking about what you said though, and I guess where I'm. So I want to go back to Black Lives Matter. Sorry, but that's so from my point of view, they're not a Christian organization, and so that's kind of I'm trying to filter all this stuff out, right? Like I'm trying to figure out, and I'm trying to justify myself. I'm trying to be really honest. I'm trying to figure out, like, okay, well, where do I fit in with this? Have I done enough? What do I need to do? Do I need to do more? And the pressure right now is just to do the Black Lives Matter thing. I mean, I could do that and shield myself from all kinds of, I wouldn't, nobody could challenge my motives because I'm on board with the zeitgeist of this.
Right. If you go march and you have a sign and you post it, you're good pretty much.
But I can't do that with Black Lives Matter because it's not a Christian organization. They don't have a biblical worldview. In fact, when I heard Tamika Mallory talk here in Houston, and all of a sudden it was like about the overthrow of capitalism. And I'm going, well, I mean, you might think that capitalism is evil, but I don't know what that has to do with the death of George Floyd. But then they would say, well, yeah, but the system is all kind of connected. It's like,
well,
okay,
and the money follows the same thing. I mean, the money that's going to Black Lives Matter, some of it's used for Black Lives Matter things, but a lot of it is then going through this PAC that's just going to, Elizabeth Warren, Joe Biden, and various other Democratic campaigns. So then you're like, well, forget where I stand on LGBT stuff, forget Marxism, just what if I'm not a Democrat and I want to support fighting racism without knowing that my money is going to, so I mean, even if you take sort of morality out of it, if you just have your political leaning, otherwise you wouldn't necessarily support them.
Well, I think, Evan, even that angst that you feel, I think that some of that is has been created, has been man created, and man manipulated as well. Kristen Bontrager, she calls it kind of the new legalism. So when it's not enough, nothing's enough actually, technically. So whatever you do, it's not enough. So you being a non-racist white male, middle, whatever class of economics you are.
I guess I'm middle class.
I know how much money you make, but
I mean, we're all in ministry, so we all really do know how much.
I do Uber Eats like 5 nights a week, so I'm doing okay.
There's still implications of who you are, because our minds we have been so just indoctrinated with these social theories of thinking about each other, and so I think from my scriptures and from my real life experiences that my life has been changed and affected the most through people, through individuals walking through life with me of different ethnicities and different colors, and people seeing that. Yes, legislation, obviously. I mean, like I said, I'm very politically minded and motivated, but the pressure, like you said, to do more is almost like you have to prove that you are,
in apologetics, it's like proving a negative. I have to prove I'm not a racist rather than.
Well, it becomes about your motives, because then you're trying, you know who you are, but you're trying to work, like it's just like with Christianity, right? Most of the New Testament, people, the Jews going back to the work-based system. And the Lord's like, no, I'm looking at your heart, your motivations, and things like that. And so with pure motives and a love for God, a love for your neighbor, I think what Sean said, sometimes as individuals, there could be more that we could be doing as individuals, but we have to look at our individual lives and see if that's the case, right? That's not for anyone else to determine what you should do and what you have to do and what you feel that, or what you need to do to feel, to be considered. Well, now it's anti-racist. So it's not enough that you're not racist. And that's part of the problem is, with bringing in a lot of this outside stuff, is that these postmodern thoughts that keep everything is evolving and definitions are evolving. And what does it mean to be not racist? What does it mean to be, and now you can't just be not racist, you have to be anti-racist and things like that. Or maybe you just are racist and you just don't know it, kind of thing. So
I read something the other day that said, if you're white, you're racist. And like, it's okay, but like recognize that, sit in the discomfort, and then move on from there. But
yeah, you can't heal or you can't do anything until you admit that you're racist, and that's the first step. And so, and then if you don't, then that just shows that your white fragility coming through more. And so
the question with that though is that not true? And so here's the thing: the people who, and survey after survey has demonstrated this, the people who say that they are the least racist tend to be the most racist. And so, and we've all had friends, folks that we know and love, who have served all around the world in different mission contexts. And what we find over and over again is that human beings have found some way to place one group over and above the other. And so what we truly know, honestly, is that everybody's racist. And so once we deal with that, like once you deal with the reality that there's a part of you that thinks that there are some races that are inherently better than others for whatever reason, like that's not a problem, that's a confession, right? And so I'm still waiting to meet the person who has honestly lived their entire life without being cut off in traffic by somebody of a particular race, or seeing a particular race do the X, Y, or Z in public or in sports, and not had a thought, oh, like that's those people, or they do things like that. Like I just truly have never met that person, right?
Listen, I think that's maybe the trend though. It's like you have to, I don't know. I think that's more of a trend to me. I think it's more of a trend.
I don't think you can deal with sins that you don't confess. And I think one of the ways that we sidestep racism and don't deal with it is because we say we're not racist. And what we mean typically when people say that they're not racist is that I am not actively doing things to hinder another race from doing something. When we carve out that little portion of it and leave out all of our negative thoughts, all of our biases, which then turn into hiring practice and friendship practices and where we go to church. And like, if you don't think the world is racist, there's one time a week where Americans can choose exactly who they want to be around and who they don't want to be around. And that's why Sunday morning at 10 o'clock is the most segregated hour of the week. And like, I don't think we can say that we're not racist, honestly. I think we come up with a lot of excuses and a lot of justifications for something that's just true in us because we live in a broken world. And it's much better to say, like, I do have these feelings about X, Y, or Z much more than I want to. And I want to confess and own that so that I can heal, right? Healing is never found in denial.
Yeah, and I would just disagree. I would just say that that's postmodernism intertwined with the definition of sin and racism, and that's again one of the problems I see with some of these, adhering to these social theories and them being intertwined in the church, is because we don't have clear definitions of right and wrong, sin. Racism.
Are you saying that everybody is sinful? But that maybe, Sean's saying everybody is racist because we all have this thought life kind of thing is maybe taking it a step too far for you. Is that the idea?
Yeah, it's what sin is. Sin is missing the mark, right? It's sinning against or doing doing things against what our holy God prescribes, and again, things against his nature. I mean, making observations about culture, that's one thing. But I don't think, but sin is a hard issue, and I don't think that a person has to admit that they are racist if they're not. I think that it is definitely a hard issue, and I think
Sean agrees it's a hard issue too. But yeah.
I mean, I know he agrees that it's a hard issue, but I think the assumption is that we all have this hard issue, and that we all have. Again, I think
it's not an assumption. What I said was I've never met anyone, and like I'm not saying that person's not out there. I am saying that I've been in ministry for 25 years. I turned 46 on Monday, and I've known thousands and thousands of people, and I've not met that person yet. Like I know a lot of people who don't want to be that person, and I don't want to be that person. But I've yet to meet that person who can honestly say that that's not something that's harbored within them. That's not warehoused within them. And the scriptures acknowledge that fact. Like that's, you might just look it up, like an article I wrote for Missio Alliance called Why American Christians are ill-equipped to deal with race, or something like that. And it's because of the confession piece. Like we just don't want to admit it. Like we just don't want to admit, and we don't want to admit it as sin.
So you're saying well, it is sin. Like we admit that racism is sin, but you're saying that we need to start at the place where, are you saying all Christians or white Christians admit that they are racist?
I'm saying that everybody on the planet is prejudiced, and that rises to race. And like if you don't deal with that reality, you can never deal. There is no spiritual solution for people who will not confess. Like you can't. Like the guy who comes home and refuses to confess the affair that he never had can never reach healing, can never reach reconciliation.
Well, this kind of gets at the last question that Evan was going to ask, right?
Yeah. We got it. We'll never always agree on this. Out of respect for y'all's time, let me ask this. One of my, I guess, again, and I'm careful how I say this, because I'm not saying I'm concerned per se, like I'm in a position to say that. But when will we know that we've kind of reached that place where we'll have achieved our goals of racial equality? What standard do we appeal to kind of find out when we get there? Or are we just on a never-ending journey? And the reason I'm asking is because I want to know what the goals are. I want to know what the goals of Black Lives Matter is, for example. And again, you don't have to defend that movement per se, or that organization. But is it that we'll never have a George Floyd situation again? Because no one can make that promise. That could happen tomorrow. Is it that or what are the systemic goals that we'll be rid of? Or are we just content to say, you know what, we need to get better. We need to get better. I guess one of my concerns is that I don't know how we win that race exactly. On the other hand, I don't want to sound like, oh, well, we're done. We got the civil rights legislation in 1964. Everyone can vote now, right? I'm not saying that.
We'll never get there, so let's stop trying. Yeah.
I would agree with you, Sean. I mean, I didn't want to come back on that. When I asked the question about interpersonal, I wasn't saying I agree with that per se. I loved your answer. I do think that basically we all have to look in our hearts. I actually wouldn't have any issue saying that there is racism within my heart. Okay. What that exactly looks like, does that mean I'm a Nazi? I don't think so, but I'm an imperfect person. I'm a sinner, and that extends to all kinds of things. But how do we know when we've got to where we want to get as Christians, or is it just an ongoing thing?
I'll let you go, Sean.
Well, I want to double back, because I think it's an important question. And I think it's important to remember about the current movement and about the civil rights movement. Like, there are signs to this effect, but no one's actually asking anyone to end racism. Like, we're asking people to end chokeholds, right? We're asking people that the police are required to de-escalate. Just in the fallout from Breonna Taylor, one of the laws that was passed last night, it's like to end no-knock warrants. So duties to intervene, ban shooting at moving vehicles, right? like, no one's saying, let's end racism in the police force, even though it'd be great. Like, you actually can't negotiate for that, which is the only tool that governmental powers have. The only tool they have is negotiation and enforcement. So there's one piece of it that's not at all about ending racism or changing hearts. And I think we need to bracket that discussion, because that's about, these are things that we think can make things on the street better. Fair judicial review where Black people don't serve 3 times as much time for the same crimes. Policing. The disproportionate policing of certain areas of town. Proximity policing, that police have to live in the neighborhood in which they patrol. Things like that can actually be negotiated. So the civil rights movement, they were concerned about actual policy on the bus, voting rights, like those are real world things. And what we find is that when some of those things change there's a percentage change in people's appreciation and affection for one another. It's just a survey came out today that even a school with 13% minority population changes the white students' attitudes toward race for the rest of their lives. So those are things that can actually be done, right? So I think that's where the church actually has a role to be much clearer and much more frequent in articulation that all people are truly made in the image of God. That you cannot embrace Jesus and hold on to any prejudice or racism. And that we are going to enshrine that in our leadership, in the way we look and sound, in the diversity of voices that we hear and perspectives that we hear. Those are actual things we can do. We can actually give people guardrails to hold on to that the rest of society just doesn't provide. So when do we reach the end of that? Well, obviously not until the parousia, like when Jesus comes back, that will kind of be at the end of it. But we can certainly create a worldview that values people
Absolutely
as made in the image of God. And I truly don't think that we've done a very good job of that.
I think we could all end that.
I mean, I do agree. I mean, I think, of course, the judicial system. I mean, even here in my area, I've been working towards. There's a judge that, and this was a Black family. There's a judge who's very lenient, and he's known to be lenient, and the inmates postpone their trials until this particular judge is on the stand, right?
Yeah.
And whether they're Black, white, whatever, he just gives more lenient sentences. And that's why sometimes, like when we're looking at statistics, it was, there's so many different dynamics that happen in that. But anyway, this particular judge who's very lenient gave this this serial domestic abuser bail, and he ended up killing his wife and son and himself. And so they, that was a Black family that was affected. But I think that in terms of how we're looking at laws can change. I think, diversity is a great thing. The more that you're exposed to people of different ethnicities and things like that, definitely your mind change towards people and things like that. So, but we have to do it together. We have to do it not looking at each other as enemy groups or as, you're my, that we have to look at each other as being unified in Christ to do that effectively. So, I think that, I don't know, I think sometimes with the Black Lives Matter movement that it is somewhat, you don't see the solution sometimes because of the, just the marching and the, and you don't know what to do. People don't know what to do, but there are things in our local government and in national government that we can do to be involved more, so.
Okay. We could talk about this all day long. Obviously, we're not going to solve the issue of, racism in America today, but I just really appreciate you guys coming out. You came to a room in your house where there was a computer, but you made the time, and I appreciate it. And I mean, if you have more thoughts on this, feel free to, submit them, and maybe we can put them in the comments section on Facebook Live. But unless anybody has any final thoughts, I think probably we should close it out so that we don't just go indefinitely. Does that sound good?
No, thanks for having me.
Thanks.
Yeah.
For the
No,
conversation.
thank you guys so much. And we might be calling you again to come talk about this or other stuff. So,
Absolutely.
all right, guys. Thanks so much.
Thank you. God bless.
Bye.